Jiwoo stepped off the transport shuttle and looked up at the massive buildings that stretched toward the purple sky of Arcturus Prime. The Galactic University stood before her like a crystal mountain, its walls made of some strange material that seemed to shift colors in the alien sunlight. She had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that she was here, she felt very small. The shuttle behind her hissed as it prepared to leave. Other students were getting off too, but they did not look like her. Some had blue skin that sparkled, like stars. Others were tall and thin with too many arms. A few looked like they were made of living metal that moved like water. Jiwoo pulled her bag closer to her chest and started walking toward the main building. She was human, and that made her different here. Earth had only joined the Galactic Federation 20 years ago. Before that, no one in the galaxy even knew humans existed. Now she was one of only 12 humans accepted to study at the most important university in known space. Her parents had been so proud when the acceptance letter came. Her whole planet had celebrated, but standing here now, surrounded by beings that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years, Jiwoo felt like a child trying to sit at the adult table. The main hall was enormous. The ceiling was so high that Jiwoo could not see the top clearly. Thousands of students moved around, talking in languages that sounded like music or static or the grinding of stones. Most of them ignored her completely. A few looked at her with what might have been curiosity or disgust. She could not tell which. Jiwoo found her way to the registration area where a being that looked like a walking tree trunk processed her paperwork. The creature had no face that she could see, but somehow it knew who she was when she approached. "Human student Jiwoo," it said in a voice like wind through leaves. "Advanced Xenobiology Program. Professor Veltar will be your primary instructor. Report to Lecture Hall Omega 7 at the second bell." The tree being handed her a small device that would help her navigate the massive campus. Jiwoo thanked it and hurried away, following the glowing path that appeared in the air in front of her when she activated the device. Lecture Hall Omega 7 was bigger than most buildings back on Earth. The seats were arranged in a steep bowl shape that could hold at least 3,000 students. Jiwoo arrived early and stood at the entrance trying to decide where to sit. Other students were already filing in, and she noticed they seemed to know exactly where to go. The blue-skinned students with the sparkling skin took seats in the very front rows. Behind them sat creatures that looked almost human, but with larger heads and eyes that seemed to glow with inner light. The metal-bodied beings chose seats in the third and fourth rows, their movements smooth and precise. Each group seemed to have its own section, its own place in the Great Hall. Jiwoo was still standing by the entrance when she heard her name called. "Jiwoo, over here!" She turned to see Kang Ho waving at her from near the back of the hall. He was another human student, and seeing his familiar face made her feel less alone. She climbed the steep steps to reach him, passing row after row of alien students who barely glanced at her. "I was starting to think I was the only human here," Jiwoo said as she sat down next to Kang Ho. "There are actually 6 of us in this class," Kang Ho replied, pointing to other seats nearby where she could see more humans scattered around the back section. "The others are Do Hyun, Hai Jin, Min Seo, and Tai Min. I think we're supposed to sit back here." "Supposed to?" Before Kang Ho could answer, a sound like crystal bells rang through the hall. The conversation stopped immediately, and all eyes turned toward the front where a figure was materializing on the speaking platform. Professor Veltar was unlike anything Jiwoo had ever seen. The being appeared to be made of living crystal, with geometric patterns that shifted and flowed across its transparent body. Light seemed to come from within it, casting rainbow patterns on the walls around the platform. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Xenobiology," Professor Veltar began. "This course will explore the fundamental principles of life as it has evolved across our galaxy. You come from many worlds and many species, each bringing your own perspective to our studies." The professor's form shifted as it spoke, and Jiwoo realized that the patterns in its body were actually some form of communication. The alien students in the front rows seemed to understand this visual language, nodding and making notes even before Veltar spoke audible words. "Before we begin, Our formal studies, the professor continued. It is important that we establish proper learning arrangements. The seating in this hall has been carefully planned to optimize the educational experience for all species. Jiwoo felt her stomach sink as she began to understand what was happening. Those species with the most advanced cognitive development and longest histories of galactic scholarship will sit in the front rows where they can best benefit from close interaction with the material. The Mindari, Veltar gestured to the blue-skinned students, with their telepathic abilities and 3,000-year history of academic excellence, will occupy the first row. The Mindari students sat straighter in their seats, their skin sparkling brighter with what Jiwoo realized was pride. The Eternals, the professor indicated the large-headed beings with glowing eyes, whose species has been studying the mysteries of the universe for 5,000 years, will take the second row. The Synthetians, Veltar's form pulsed as it acknowledged the metal-bodied students, whose technological integration allows for perfect memory and calculation, will sit in the third row. The pattern continued as the professor worked its way back through the hall, assigning each species to seats based on what it called their intellectual hierarchy. The beings that looked like walking trees were given the 8th row. Creatures that resembled giant insects got the 10th row. Each assignment came with a brief description of that species' supposed intellectual capabilities and contributions to galactic knowledge. Finally, Professor Veltar's attention turned to the back of the hall where Jiwoo and the other humans sat. The humans, the professor said, and Jiwoo could hear something like amusement in its crystalline voice. Being the newest members of our galactic community, and having achieved spaceflight only recently, will occupy the final 3 rows. This arrangement will allow them to observe and learn from the more developed species, while minimizing disruption to the advanced discussions that will take place among our senior students. Jiwoo felt heat rise in her cheeks. Around her, she could hear some of the alien students making sounds that might have been laughter. Kang-ho started to stand up, his face red with anger, but Do-hyun grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. "It's okay," Do-hyun whispered, though his own jaw was tight with controlled rage. Professor Veltar seemed pleased with the seating arrangement. These positions are fixed for the entire semester and have been approved by the Academic Council, based on extensive research into species-specific learning patterns. Now let us begin with our first topic, the fundamental building blocks of carbon-based life. As the lecture began, Jiwoo found herself staring at the backs of hundreds of alien heads. From where she sat, she could barely see the professors' visual displays clearly. The sounds of the lecture seemed distant and muffled. She was supposed to be learning about xenobiology, but instead she was learning about her place in the galactic community, and that place was apparently at the very back of the room. She looked around at her fellow humans. Hai-jin was taking notes, furiously as if she could overcome the insult through pure determination. Minseo stared straight ahead with an expression of quiet dignity. Tai-min seemed to be studying the other students more than listening to the lecture. Kang-ho was still angry, his hands clenched into fists. But as Jiwoo sat there in the back row, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling defeated, she began to notice things that the students in front could not see. She could observe the behavior of every species in the hall. She could see how the Mindari students leaned forward eagerly but often looked confused when the professor discussed practical applications. She watched the Eternals nod along with theoretical concepts, but seemed lost when the topic shifted to newer discoveries. The Synthetians took perfect notes but never asked questions that showed real understanding. From the back row, Jiwoo could see the whole picture. And maybe, she thought as she settled into her assigned seat, that was going to be more valuable than anyone realized. 3 weeks had passed since the humiliating seating assignment, and Jiwoo had settled into a routine that would have surprised Professor Veltar. While the alien students in the front rows focused intensely on every word of the lectures, Jiwoo spent her time watching and learning in ways the professor never intended. Every morning she arrived early to claim the same seat in the back corner, where she had the best view of the entire lecture hall. From this position, she could observe Not just the professor, but every species in the room and how they responded to different types of information. What she discovered was fascinating and completely at odds with the supposed intellectual hierarchy that determined their seating. The Mindari in the front row were indeed telepathic, but Jiwoo noticed they struggled whenever Professor Veltar presented information that required thinking in multiple directions at once. When the lecture covered symbiotic relationships between different organisms, the Mindari students would look confused and often turn to each other for mental communication that seemed more like asking for help than sharing insights. Their telepathic abilities seemed to make them excellent at sharing known information, but poor at generating new ideas when faced with complex problems. The Eternals in the second row had a different weakness. They possessed vast knowledge from their 5,000-year academic tradition, but Jiwoo observed that they became uncomfortable whenever new discoveries contradicted their ancient texts. During a lecture about recently discovered life forms that used silicon instead of carbon as their base element, several Eternal students actually got up and left the hall. Those who remained spent the rest of the session frantically searching through their data tablets, apparently trying to find some way to fit the new information into their existing knowledge framework. The Synthetians were perhaps the most interesting to watch. Their metal bodies never moved unnecessarily and they recorded everything with perfect accuracy. But when Professor Veltar asked questions that required intuitive leaps or creative thinking, the Synthetians would pause for long moments, their bodies flickering with internal calculations. They could process known data incredibly fast, but they seemed unable to make the kind of logical jumps that led to new understanding. Jiwoo began keeping a notebook where she recorded these observations. She wrote in Korean, reasoning that even if someone saw her notes, they would not be able to read them. During her second week of observation, Haejin noticed what she was doing. "What are you writing about?" Haejin whispered during a break-in. The lecture Jiwoo showed her the notebook. Haejin's eyes widened as she read the detailed behavioral observations. "This is amazing," she said quietly. "I never noticed half of these patterns." "It's easier to see from back here," Jiwoo replied. "The front row students are too focused on the professor to notice what's happening around them." Haejin started, making her own observations, focusing on different aspects than Jiwoo. She noticed that certain species worked well together, while others seemed to have natural conflicts. The insect-like hive students could coordinate perfectly with each other, but became agitated when forced to work with the individualistic wanderer species. The tree-like grove students seemed to understand plant-based life forms intuitively, but were completely lost when discussing animal behavior. By the fourth week, Do-hyun had joined their informal observation project. Unlike Jiwoo and Haejin, who focused on behavior, Do-hyun was interested in the content of the lectures themselves. He began developing theories that combined ideas from different parts of the course in ways that Professor Veltar never suggested. "Look at this," Do-hyun said one day as they sat in the cafeteria after class. The human students had naturally gravitated toward eating together, partly because they were the only ones who could digest the same types of food, and partly because they were more comfortable with their own species. Professor Veltar teaches about evolution, ecology, and biochemistry as if they are separate subjects. But they're all connected. The way a planet's environment shapes its chemistry, which shapes how life evolves, which changes the environment again. Kang-ho looked up from his meal. He had been the angriest about the seating arrangement and was still bitter about the treatment they received. So what? The professor isn't going to care about theories from humans sitting in the back row. "Maybe not," Do-hyun said, "but I think we're seeing things differently because we're human. We think about connections between things. Most of these alien species seem to be very focused on just one way of thinking." Min-seo, who rarely spoke during their discussions, nodded thoughtfully. "I've been reading about Earth ecology in my free time," she said. "The way ecosystems work on our planet is different from what Professor Veltar describes from other worlds. Most alien worlds seem to have very stable, predictable systems, but Earth's ecosystems are always changing, always adapting to new challenges. That's because Earth has been through so many disasters," Taemin added. He was the quietest of all the humans, but when he spoke, the others always listened. Ice ages, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions. Life on Earth had to learn to be flexible or it would die. Maybe that's why humans think differently. Ji-woo found this conversation fascinating. She had been focused on observing the alien students, but her classmates were making her realize that the humans themselves might be the most interesting subjects to study. They approached problems in ways that none of the advanced alien species seemed capable of. The next day, Ji-woo paid more attention to how the human students responded during lectures. When Professor Veltar described a planetary ecosystem that had collapsed for unknown reasons, the alien students suggested increasingly complex technical solutions. The Mindari proposed telepathic intervention to coordinate species behavior. The Synthetians wanted to build mechanical systems to replace failed biological ones. The Eternals searched their ancient records for similar cases and proposed traditional solutions that had worked in the past. But when Tai Min raised his hand, his suggestion was completely different. Maybe the ecosystem didn't collapse because something went wrong, he said in his quiet voice. Maybe it collapsed because everything went too right. If a system becomes too perfect, too stable, it might lose the ability to handle any change at all. The lecture hall went silent. Professor Veltar's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been surprise. "Please elaborate on this theory," the professor said. Taemin stood up looking nervous but determined. On Earth, ecosystems that face regular small disasters usually survive better than ones that never face any challenges. The challenges make them stronger and more flexible. A perfect ecosystem might be like a muscle that never gets used. When it finally faces a real problem, it's too weak to handle it. Several alien students turned in their seats to stare at Taemin. The idea seemed to genuinely surprise them. Professor Veltar made notes on its data tablet, the first time Ji-woo had seen the professor record a student comment. After class, the human students gathered in their usual corner of the cafeteria. "That was brilliant," Haijin told Taemin. "I never would have thought of that." "It's not brilliant," Taemin replied, looking uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just how things work on Earth. But I think maybe that's the point. We're used to things being chaotic and unpredictable. These alien species all come from worlds where everything follows rules and patterns." Ji-woo realized that Taemin was right. Looking back at her weeks of observations, she could see that every alien species seemed to expect the universe to behave in orderly, predictable ways. When faced with chaos or unexpected changes, they responded by trying to impose order rather than adapting to the chaos. Humans, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on uncertainty. They looked for patterns in chaos and found ways to work with unpredictable systems rather than against them. It was a completely different approach to understanding the universe. As the weeks continued, Ji-woo noticed that the human students were becoming more confident in class discussions. They still sat in the back rows, but they were no longer silent observers. Their questions and comments often approached problems from angles that the alien students had never considered. And increasingly, Professor Veltar seemed interested in these unusual perspectives. The seating arrangement that was supposed to marginalize the humans was actually giving them a unique advantage. From the back of the hall, they could see the big picture that the front row students missed. They could observe how different species thought and where their thinking failed. And they were developing their own approaches to xenobiology that combined observation, intuition, and the hard-earned wisdom of a species that had learned to survive in an unpredictable universe. Ji-woo smiled as she settled into her back row seat for another day of observation. Professor Veltar had assigned the humans to the back because they were supposedly the least advanced species in the room. But Ji-woo was beginning to suspect that their position at the back might make them the most advanced students of all. The announcement came during the 8th week of the semester, and it changed everything. Professor Veltar's crystalline form pulsed with unusual intensity as it addressed the lecture hall, and Ji-woo could sense excitement rippling through the advanced students in the front rows. "Your midterm project," the professor declared, "will be to solve one of the great mysteries of xenobiology. The Kepler extinction paradox has puzzled the greatest minds in our galaxy for over 100 years. You will work in species groups to propose a solution to why the entire ecosystem of Kepler 442b collapsed despite having no apparent external threats. Jiwoo felt her pulse quicken. She had read about the Kepler mystery during her preparation for the university. An entire planet's worth of life had simply vanished over the course of a few years, leaving behind only fossils and empty cities. No asteroids had hit the planet. No nearby stars had gone supernova. No wars had been fought. The planet's climate had remained stable. Yet somehow, every living thing had died. The Mindari students immediately began forming telepathic discussion, circles, their blue skin flickering with rapid mental exchanges. The Eternals gathered around their eldest member, who began accessing ancient databases that might contain relevant historical precedents. The Synthetians moved with mechanical precision to establish research protocols and data analysis frameworks. In Nodindir, the back rows, the 6 human students looked at each other uncertainly. "We're supposed to work in species groups," Kang Ho said. "I guess that means just us. Against teams that have telepathic coordination, 1,000-year databases, and perfect computational abilities," Hei Jin added, her voice flat with resignation. But Jiwoo was already thinking differently. "Maybe that's exactly what we need," she said slowly. "Look at what they're all doing. The Mindari are sharing existing knowledge telepathically. The Eternals are searching old records. The Synthetians are setting up analysis systems for known data types. They're all approaching this the same way they approach everything else." Do-hyun leaned forward with interest. "You mean they're trying to solve it using the methods that work for problems they already understand?" "Exactly. But this isn't a problem anyone understands. It's been unsolved for 100 years precisely because the normal approaches don't work." Tae-min, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "On Earth, when scientists couldn't solve a problem using traditional methods, they had to try completely different approaches. Sometimes the breakthrough came from thinking about the problem in a totally new way." Minseo nodded. "In ecology, some of the biggest discoveries happened when researchers stopped focusing on individual species and started looking at the relationships between species and their environment. Over the next few days, while the alien teams deployed increasingly sophisticated research tools, the human students took a much simpler approach. They found a small study room in the oldest part of the library, where the lighting was dim and the furniture was clearly designed for humans, or similarly sized species. It was not impressive, but it was theirs. "Let's start with what we know," Jiwoo said, spreading out printed copies of the basic Kepler data on the worn table. Kepler 442b was considered a paradise world. Perfect climate, abundant resources, no natural disasters, no predators that threatened the dominant species. The dominant species was highly intelligent, Hei Jin added, reading from her notes. They had developed advanced technology, eliminated disease, achieved perfect population control, and created a completely stable society. They had solved every major problem their species had ever faced, Do-hyun continued. Food production was optimized. Energy was limitless and clean. They had eliminated war, crime, and even accidental death. Kang Ho frowned. "That sounds like paradise. Why would paradise collapse?" "Maybe that's the wrong question," Tae-min said quietly. "Maybe we should ask what happens when a species solves all its problems." The room went silent as everyone considered this. Jiwoo felt something click in her mind, like a puzzle piece falling into place. "On Earth," she said slowly, "what happens to muscles that never get used?" "They atrophy," Minseo answered immediately. "They get weaker." "What happens to immune systems that never face any diseases?" "They stop working properly," Hei Jin said, her eyes widening as she began to understand where Jiwoo was going. "What happens to species that never face any challenges?" The implications hung in the air like a revelation. Do-hyun was the first to put it into words. "They lose the ability to adapt." Jiwoo nodded excitedly. The Kepler species didn't die because something attacked them. They died because they had become too perfect, too specialized for their perfect world. When even the smallest change occurred, they couldn't handle it. "But what change?" Kang Ho asked. "The records show that nothing in their environment changed." Tae-min was already pulling up genetic data on his tablet. "Maybe the change was internal. If a species stops facing evolutionary pressure, What happens to genetic diversity? Min Seo understood first. It disappears. When survival is guaranteed, there's no pressure to maintain genetic variations. The population gradually becomes more and more similar. Until one disease, one genetic flaw, one tiny problem affects everyone the same way, Jiwoo finished. They spent the next week developing their theory. Unlike the alien teams with their complex simulations and vast databases, the humans focused on simple behavioral observations and evolutionary principles. They looked at examples from Earth where species had faced similar situations. They studied the historical data from Kepler, not for evidence of external threats but for signs of internal weakness. What they found was a pattern that the advanced alien students had completely missed. The Kepler species had achieved genetic optimization about 50 years before the collapse. They had eliminated what they called inferior genetic traits from their population. At the same time, they had standardized their society to eliminate all sources of stress, competition, and unpredictability. The result was a species that was perfectly adapted to their perfect world and completely unable to adapt to anything else. When a simple genetic mutation occurred, one that would have been easily handled by a genetically diverse population, it spread through the entire species like wildfire, because they had all become essentially identical. "It's brilliant," Heijin said as they prepared their final presentation. "They didn't die from external disaster. They died from internal perfection." And the really scary part, Do-hyun added, is that from their perspective, they were doing everything right. They thought they were building paradise. Jiwoo looked around at her teammates and felt a surge of pride. They had approached this problem completely differently from every other team in the class. While the aliens had focused on their individual species' strengths, the humans had worked together, combining different perspectives and ways of thinking. While the others had looked for complex explanations, the humans had found an elegantly simple answer. But the real breakthrough was not just in solving the Kepler mystery. It was in understanding something fundamental about intelligence itself. The alien species in the front rows were all highly specialized. The Mindari were exceptional at telepathic communication but poor at individual creativity. The Eternals had vast knowledge but struggled with new ideas. The Synthetians could process data perfectly but could not make intuitive leaps. Humans, sitting in the back rows because they were supposedly the least advanced, had something that none of the specialized species possessed. They had diversity, not just genetic diversity, but cognitive diversity. They could think in multiple ways, approach problems from different angles, and combine different types of intelligence into something greater than the sum of its parts. As Jiwoo prepared to present their solution to Professor Veltar and the entire class, she realized that the humans had discovered something much more important than the cause of the Kepler extinction. They had discovered their own greatest strength. The species that had been assigned to the back of the lecture hall because they were supposedly primitive were about to demonstrate that sometimes the most advanced solution comes from the most unexpected source. And Jiwoo had a feeling that after tomorrow's presentation, the dynamics of the classroom would never be the same. She looked at her 5 human teammates, each brilliant in their own way, each contributing something unique to their collective understanding. Tomorrow, they would show the galaxy that there was more than one way to be intelligent, and that sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem was to think about it in a completely different way. The Kepler extinction paradox was about to be solved, and the solution would come from the back row. The lecture hall was more crowded than Jiwoo had ever seen it. Word had spread that the midterm presentations would be public, and students from other departments had come to watch the teams attempt to solve the famous Kepler mystery. Even some faculty members sat in the upper rows, their alien forms creating strange shadows in the dim lighting. Professor Veltar stood at the center of the speaking platform, its crystalline body pulsing with anticipation. Today we will hear proposed solutions to the Kepler extinction paradox from each species group. We will begin with our most advanced students and proceed in order of academic seniority. Jiwoo felt her stomach tighten. That meant the humans would present last, after every other team had shared their findings. She looked around at her teammates, who were all trying to appear calm despite the obvious nervousness on their faces. The Mindari went first, their lead presenter rising gracefully from the front row. As she spoke, her blue skin flickered with patterns that Jiwoo now recognized as telepathic communication with her teammates. Their presentation was impressive, full of detailed psychological profiles of the Kepler species and complex models of social collapse. We believe the Kepler extinction resulted from a cascade failure in telepathic social networks, the Mindari presenter explained. When advanced species develop mental connectivity, they become vulnerable to psychic storms that can propagate destructive thoughts across entire populations. The presentation was sophisticated and well-researched, but Jiwoo noticed that it was entirely based on the Mindari's own experience with telepathic society. They had essentially projected their own potential weaknesses onto the Kepler species, without considering that the Kepler beings might have faced completely different challenges. Professor Veltar made notes and asked several probing questions, before dismissing the Mindari team with polite praise for their innovative psychological modeling. The Eternals presented next, their eldest representative accessing vast databases of historical information. Their solution involved comparing the Kepler collapse to 17 similar events recorded in their ancient archives. They proposed that cyclical cosmic forces, invisible to modern detection methods, periodically caused mass extinctions across the galaxy. The patterns are clear when viewed across sufficient temporal spans, the Eternal presenter intoned in a voice like distant thunder. What appears mysterious to younger civilizations becomes obvious when one possesses adequate historical perspective. It was an elegant theory supported by thousands of years of data, but Jiwoo could see the flaw immediately. The Eternals were so focused on finding patterns in their old records that they had not seriously considered the possibility that the Kepler event might be genuinely unique. The Synthetians followed with a presentation that was technically flawless. They had created detailed computer models of the Kepler ecosystem, running millions of simulations to identify possible failure points. Their conclusion was that a previously unknown pathogen must have affected the planet's primary food source, causing a rapid collapse of the entire food web. Our computational analysis indicates a 97.3% probability that biological contamination was the primary causal factor, the Synthetian presenter stated with mechanical precision. We have identified 14 possible vectors for such contamination. Professor T. Veltar seemed impressed by the thoroughness of their analysis, but Jiwoo noticed that the Synthetians had made a fundamental assumption. They had programmed their models to look for external causes because their logical frameworks could not easily process the concept of a system destroying itself through its own success. Team after team presented their solutions. The insect-like hive students proposed that the Kepler species had been attacked by a coordinated alien invasion that left no traces. The tree-like grove students suggested that planetary consciousness had become depressed and chosen to end its own existence. Each presentation reflected the thinking patterns and cultural assumptions of the species that created it. As the afternoon wore on, Jiwoo began to feel a strange mix of excitement and terror. All of the proposed solutions were impressive in their own ways, but none of them felt complete. They were all trying to solve the Kepler mystery using the same kinds of thinking that had failed to solve it for the past 100 years. Finally, Professor Veltar called for the last presentation. The human team will now share their findings. Jiwoo stood up from her back row seat and began the long walk down to the speaking platform. The journey seemed to take forever, passing row after row of alien students who watched her with expressions ranging from polite curiosity to barely concealed amusement. She was acutely aware that she was representing not just her team, but her entire species. When she reached the platform, Jiwoo turned to face the massive audience. Thousands of alien eyes focused on her, and she felt very small and very human. But then she looked back at the last 3 rows where her teammates sat, and she remembered everything they had discovered together. The Kepler species did not die from external attack, Jiwoo began, her voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect hall. They did not fall victim to cosmic forces or unknown pathogens or psychic storms. They died because they succeeded, too completely. A murmur of confusion rippled through the audience. Professor Veltar's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been surprise. For 50 years before the collapse, the Kepler species lived in paradise, Jiwoo continued. They had eliminated every challenge, solved every problem, removed every source of stress or difficulty from their existence. They had achieved genetic perfection, social perfection, and environmental perfection. She activated the display system and showed the audience a simple graph that her team had created. It showed the timeline of Kepler achievements, alongside the gradual decline in genetic diversity that had occurred during the same period. When a species faces no challenges, it loses the ability to face challenges, Jiwoo explained. When survival is guaranteed, evolutionary pressure disappears. When problems never occur, problem-solving abilities atrophy. The Kepler species became perfectly adapted to their perfect world, which made them completely unable to adapt to anything else. Taemin stood up in the back row to present the next part of their analysis. His quiet voice somehow carried to every corner of the enormous hall. We found evidence that the Kepler species had standardized their genetics 50 years before the collapse, he said. They eliminated what they called inferior traits from their population. This created a species that was genetically identical in all the ways they thought mattered. When a simple mutation occurred, Minseo added, rising from her seat, a mutation that a genetically diverse population would have easily survived. It affected every individual the same way. Because they had all been optimized for the same perfect environment, they all had the same vulnerabilities. Do-hyun was next, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. The collapse was not a disaster. It was an inevitable result of their success. They had built a society so perfect that it could not survive even the smallest imperfection. Haejin presented their supporting evidence, showing how similar patterns of collapse had occurred in isolated ecosystems on Earth, when species became over-specialized for specific environments. And Kang-ho concluded by explaining how their theory accounted for all the mysterious aspects of the Kepler event that other theories could not explain. When the human presentation ended, the lecture hall was completely silent. Jiwoo looked out at the sea of alien faces and saw expressions she had never seen before. The Minbari students were not telepathically conferring with each other. The Eternals were not consulting their ancient databases. The Synthetians were not running calculations. They were all simply staring, as if they had heard something that challenged everything they thought they knew about intelligence and survival. Professor Veltar was the first to speak. This theory, the professor said slowly, suggests that perfection itself can be a form of weakness. Yes, Jiwoo replied. Perfection eliminates the diversity and adaptability that life needs to survive in an unpredictable universe. But how could a species avoid this trap? Asked a Minbari student from the front row. If success leads to extinction, what is the purpose of trying to improve? It was Taemin who answered, his quiet voice somehow carrying more authority than any of the louder speakers who had presented earlier. Maybe the goal should not be to eliminate all challenges, he said. Maybe the goal should be to become better at facing whatever challenges come next. The questions that followed were unlike anything Jiwoo had experienced in the class before. Instead of trying to poke holes in the human theory, the alien students seemed genuinely curious about this completely different way of thinking about success and failure. They wanted to understand how a species could deliberately choose to maintain diversity and unpredictability instead of optimizing for perfection. When the session finally ended, Jiwoo and her teammates made their way back to their seats in the last 3 rows. But as they climbed the steep steps, something had changed. The alien students in the front rows were turning to watch them go, and their expressions held something that looked very much like respect. Professor Veltar's final announcement confirmed what Jiwoo already knew. The change began immediately, but Jiwoo did not notice it at first because she was still processing what had happened during the presentation. She walked through the campus in a daze, replaying the moment when the entire lecture hall had fallen, silent as her team explained their solution to the Kepler mystery. The looks of surprise and respect from species that had treated humans as intellectually inferior just hours before felt surreal. It was Kang-ho who first realized that something fundamental had shifted. "Did you see the way that Minbari student asked for our contact information?" he said as the human students gathered in their usual corner of the cafeteria. She said her research team wanted to collaborate with us on their next project. 3 different professors have sent me messages, Heijin added, checking her communication device. They want to know if I would be interested in research assistantships. Do-hyun looked confused. Professor Veltar just invited our entire team to present our findings at the Galactic Xenobiology Conference next month. That conference only accepts papers from the most prestigious research teams in the galaxy. As word of the human breakthrough spread beyond the advanced xenobiology class, the requests for collaboration and consultation began pouring in. Within a week, every human student in the program had received multiple offers from alien research, groups who wanted access to what they were calling the human perspective. Minseo was approached by a team of eternal researchers who had been struggling with a 1,000-year-old puzzle about ecosystem stability. Taiman was invited to join a Synthetian project that was trying to understand why their perfectly logical solutions to environmental problems kept failing in practice. Even the most advanced alien students were seeking out human teammates for their research projects. But the most significant change was not in how the aliens treated the humans. It was in how they treated the concept of intelligence itself. Professor Veltar announced a major revision to the course structure during the class following the presentations. The crystalline being stood at the front of the lecture hall, its form pulsing with what Jiwoo had learned to recognize as excitement. Recent developments have shown us that our understanding of cognitive hierarchy requires fundamental reconsideration, the professor declared. We have learned that intellectual advancement cannot be measured solely by technological achievement or historical academic tradition. Jiwoo looked around the lecture hall and noticed something remarkable. The front 3 rows, which had been completely filled at the beginning of the semester, were now mostly empty. Alien students had gradually begun moving toward the back of the hall, apparently hoping to gain some of the observational advantages that had served the humans so well. Therefore, Professor Veltar continued, we will be restructuring our seating arrangements to reflect a more collaborative approach to learning. Students will be organized into mixed species research groups rather than separated by assumed cognitive capabilities. A Mindari student raised her hand. Professor, will the humans be willing to share their observational techniques with other species? The question surprised Jiwoo. For the entire semester, the humans had been treated as inferior students who should be grateful for the chance to learn from their betters. Now the supposedly superior species were asking to learn from them. That will be up to the humans themselves, Professor Veltar replied, looking toward the back rows where Jiwoo and her teammates sat. Jiwoo stood up, feeling the weight of hundreds of alien eyes upon her. We would be happy to share what we have learned, she said. But I think there might be a misunderstanding about what makes our approach different. She paused, choosing her words carefully. It is not about sitting in the back rows. It is about thinking like outsiders. We developed our perspective because we were treated as outsiders, because we were forced to observe rather than participate, because we had to find different ways to understand things. Taemin rose from his seat to add his thoughts. Moving to the back of the room will not automatically give you our perspective. You have to genuinely accept that your way of thinking might not be the only way, or even the best way, for every situation. The implications of this statement rippled through the lecture hall. For species that had spent thousands of years believing in their own cognitive superiority, accepting that they might learn from supposedly primitive humans, was a profound shift in worldview. Over the following weeks, Jiwoo watched as the entire dynamic of the class transformed. The rigid hierarchy that had defined the first half of the semester dissolved into something much more fluid and collaborative. Alien students began asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity, rather than attempts to demonstrate their knowledge. They started approaching problems with the kind of humility that allowed for real learning. But the most interesting development came when the aliens began to discover their own unique strengths in collaboration with humans. The Mindari students found that their telepathic abilities, when combined with human intuition, could generate insights that neither species could achieve alone. The Eternals learned that their vast historical knowledge became much more valuable when humans helped them see new patterns and connections in old data. The Synthetians discovered that their computational power was most effective when humans provided the creative hypotheses to test. Jiwoo realized that the real lesson of the Kepler mystery was not just about the dangers of perfection, it was about the value of diversity itself. Just as the Kepler species had died from becoming too similar to each other, the galactic academic community had been limiting itself by believing that intelligence came in only a few acceptable forms. As the semester progressed toward its end, Professor Veltar made an announcement that surprised everyone. Next semester, the Advanced Xenobiology program will be restructured as an integrated multi-species curriculum. Students will work in deliberately diverse teams from the beginning of the course, and our goal will be to develop new forms of collaborative intelligence rather than competing to demonstrate individual species superiority. After class, Jiwoo and her human teammates gathered one last time in their corner of the cafeteria. They had become minor celebrities on campus, but they still preferred each other's company to the constant attention from alien students seeking their insights. "It is strange how things worked out," Kang-ho said. "We came here expecting to learn from advanced alien civilizations, and instead we ended up teaching them." "I think we did both," Minseo replied thoughtfully. "We learned about xenobiology and galactic history and all the things we came here to study, but we also learned something more important about the value of our own perspective." Do-hyun nodded. "The aliens taught us about their technologies and their histories. We taught them about thinking differently, about questioning assumptions, about the strength that comes from diversity. And the most important lesson," Taemin added in his quiet way, "is that every species, every perspective, every way of thinking has something valuable to contribute. The problem was never that some species were superior to others. The problem was believing that superiority was the point." Jiwoo looked around at her teammates and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had come to Arcturus Prime as representatives of a supposedly primitive species, assigned to the back rows because they were considered intellectually inferior. But from those back rows, they had seen things that the front row students had missed. They had solved mysteries that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds, and they had helped reshape the entire concept of intelligence and learning. The next semester would bring new challenges and new opportunities. The lecture hall would be organized differently, with mixed species teams working together from the beginning. The rigid hierarchy that had defined galactic academia for millennia would be replaced by something more flexible and collaborative. But Jiwoo knew that she and her fellow humans would always remember the lessons they had learned from the back rows. They had discovered that sometimes the best view comes from the position that others consider inferior. They had learned that being an outsider, while sometimes painful, could also be a source of unique insight and strength. As they prepared to leave the cafeteria, Jiwoo took one last look around at the diverse mix of alien students who now sought out human perspectives on their research projects. The species that had once been assigned to the back because they were supposedly least advanced had become the most sought-after collaborators in the galaxy. The first 3 rows of Lecture Hall Omega-7 would indeed remain empty next semester, but not because anyone was forced to sit there. They would remain empty because everyone had learned that the best view of the universe comes from stepping back far enough to see the whole picture, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. The humans had taught the galaxy that intelligence was not about hierarchy or superiority. It was about diversity, collaboration, and the humility to learn from everyone, especially those who think differently than you do. And that lesson would reshape not just one university class, but the entire future of galactic civilization.